Vietnam, 1967. Long before rumors became legend, a strange order circulated quietly among American Marines stationed in the dense jungles of Southeast Asia. It sounded absurd, almost laughable at first. At the time, Australian forces operated primarily from Nui Dat Base in Phuoc Tuy Province, conducting long-range patrols alongside American units. According to stories later shared among American troops, a warning began circulating: if you saw an Australian soldier's rucksack lying alone on the ground, walk away. Do not investigate, do not ask questions, and above all, do not touch it. No official explanation was ever documented, and the warning existed mostly in soldier stories rather than formal doctrine. Yet the warning spread from unit to unit, repeated in low voices by veterans who had already learned the lesson the hard way. Some American soldiers informally referred to them as jungle ghosts or bush soldiers. They looked nothing like elite soldiers. Their uniforms hung in filthy rags, their bodies carried the sour odor of weeks without washing, and they seemed capable of disappearing into the jungle canopy as if swallowed by the earth itself. Most Marines assumed the stories were exaggerations born from heat, exhaustion, and fear, until one man decided to test the myth. A helicopter crew chief spotted a weather-stained canvas pack abandoned near a landing zone. He stared at it, half amused. How dangerous could a backpack really be? Curiosity won. Inside, he expected spare rations, ammunition, maybe personal gear. Instead, he uncovered something far more unsettling: proof that the men fighting beside American forces had crossed a line long ago. They appeared to operate by methods very different from conventional Western military doctrine. Many soldiers later claimed the Viet Cong showed unusual caution toward Australian patrols. Today, we uncover the truth behind the Australian ghosts of the forest, and why their methods unsettled even their allies. Because the reality was darker than any battlefield legend. Many of the stories that followed came not from official reports, but from the memories of soldiers, where experience, rumor, and reality often became indistinguishable. Arrival at Nui Dat. The Huey helicopter slammed onto the red laterite soil with a thunderous roar, rotors shredding the humid air and throwing clouds of dust mixed with diesel fumes and rotting vegetation. A U.S. Army intelligence officer, whom we'll call Whitfield, stepped out into the heat of Phuoc Tuy Province for the first time. That moment would divide his life into two parts: before Nui Dat and after. He had studied classified briefings. He had read casualty reports stamped top secret. He knew the statistics, the kill ratios, the commendations. None of it prepared him for what he was about to witness. The jungle heat felt alive, thick and suffocating, like a soaked wool blanket wrapped around his body. But what struck him first wasn't the temperature, it was the smell. It crept into his lungs with animal intensity, triggering an instinctive recoil. Something feral lingered in the air. Then 5 figures emerged from the tree line. Whitfield froze. They wore no recognizable insignia. Their uniforms had faded into strange colors. Half mud, half decay. Grease paint covered their faces, turning human expressions into something almost inhuman. One soldier dragged a rucksack that looked as though it had crossed every swamp in Asia. Acting on pure reflex, Whitfield stepped forward to help the exhausted man lift the load. A powerful hand clamped around his arm before he could touch it. An Australian sergeant held him in place, grip like steel. That single gesture may have saved Whitfield's life. The lesson begins. The sergeant, a veteran of multiple tours, whose real name never appeared in American records, studied Whitfield with cold, unreadable eyes. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough to force attention. Never touch our gear. It wasn't advice. It was a sentence. Inside those rucksacks, he explained, wasn't just equipment. Sometimes, death itself. Whitfield didn't yet understand why these elite soldiers resembled homeless drifters, or why even hardened Viet Cong fighters treated them with caution, bordering on fear. But the shock he felt was only the first crack in everything West Point had taught him about modern warfare. The American military believed in firepower, logistics, and technological superiority. The Australians believed in something older: survival. To American Marines, veterans of amphibious assaults and large-scale operations, the Australians appeared undisciplined, even disgusting. What they failed to realize was that the filth itself was part of the weapon. Whitfield soon learned that the answer had little to do with discipline and everything to do with biology. Some veterans later argued that minimizing artificial scent became one of the Australians' most effective field adaptations, becoming the jungle. To American officers in the mid-1960s, the idea sounded absurd. The U.S. Army invested enormous resources into hygiene. Clean uniforms, scented soap, fresh rations, these were signs of professionalism and morale. A clean soldier was considered an effective soldier, but the jungle followed different laws. The Australians understood that civilization carried a scent, and in Vietnam, that scent meant death. American troops moved through the forest, surrounded by an invisible chemical signature. Canned meat, cigarettes, detergent, aftershave, chewing gum. To a Viet Cong fighter who had lived in the jungle for months, those smells announced an enemy long before visual contact. An American patrol could be detected hundreds of meters away. They smelled like home, and home did not belong in the jungle. Australian SAS operators prepared differently. Days before patrols, they abandoned soap, toothpaste, deodorant, anything artificial. Layers of sweat, bacteria and dirt formed a natural camouflage. Their diets changed as well. No Western rations, only local food, rice, dried fish, chili peppers. Some veterans later described another adaptation, one that sounded shocking to outsiders. Fish sauce, nuec mam, is mentioned in some recollections, though it's difficult to verify how widespread it truly was. Some accounts claim Australian patrols adopted local foods and avoided strong artificial scents, although historians debate how systematic these practices truly were. Some accounts claim their equipment was deliberately dirtied and descented to blend in, though the exact methods vary between retellings. The transformation wasn't cosmetic. In veteran retellings, it was described as a kind of mimicry, less about appearance, more about minimizing what gave them away. When American units advanced, birds scattered, and monkeys screamed warnings through the canopy. Many American soldiers later described the Australians as moving through the jungle with unusual stealth and patience. They became ghosts. The invisible soldiers. Whitfield witnessed the proof firsthand. An American patrol returned near the base perimeter, tired, relaxed, confident in friendly territory. Packs dropped, cigarettes lit, voices carried lazily through the humid air. To Whitfield, they looked like soldiers resting. To the jungle, they were targets. Then the ground moved. 4 feet from a lieutenant's boot. What appeared to be mud and dead foliage slowly rose upright. In stories told afterward, an Australian SAS operator seemed to rise out of the ground itself, a result of extreme concealment and stillness. He had been there the entire time, motionless, while an entire American squad passed within inches of him. Weapons snapped up in panic before realization spread. The creature was friendly. The Americans hadn't failed because of poor training. They failed because the concealed soldier blended so completely into the environment that he went unnoticed. For a moment, their attention slid past him, as if the jungle itself had swallowed the outline of a man. One by one, more bushes stood up around them, 4 additional Australians, revealing a perfect encirclement. Had they been Viet Cong, the patrol would have died before finishing their cigarettes. It was humiliation, and a masterclass in jungle warfare. But concealment was only half the doctrine. The other half explained why touching an Australian rucksack could be fatal. The exploding packs. To most soldiers, a backpack is ordinary equipment. To the SAS, it was sacred ground. Every rucksack was treated as both lifeline and trap. If captured by the enemy, it had to become a weapon. During a routine helicopter extraction, an American crew chief saw an exhausted Australian operator approaching his aircraft. Acting out of simple kindness, he jumped down to help lift the heavy pack aboard. According to one widely repeated story, the pack was believed to contain a defensive trap. Accounts differ on what happened next, and the incident remains debated among veterans. The blast hurled him backward onto the helicopter floor. His hand shattered instantly. His military career ended in a single second. Shock froze the landing zone. How could friendly equipment attack its own ally? The Australian showed no anger, no apology. He secured the pack calmly and boarded the aircraft. In the logic described by veterans, the rule felt absolute. Australian patrol doctrine emphasized preventing captured equipment from being used by the enemy. If a stranger touched it, he became a risk. Courtesy had no place in survival. From that day forward, the story of the exploding rucksack spread across American units like a ghost tale whispered after dark, a reminder that somewhere in the Vietnamese jungle fought men who had abandoned conventional war entirely, men who had learned how to become part of the forest itself. Allies keep distance. After the story spread, many American units informally adopted a simple rule: stay away from Australian gear. Not be careful, not ask permission, just don't go near it. Pilots stopped offering to help with straps. Crew chiefs kept their hands to themselves. Even the friendliest Marines learned to stand back. and the space between the two Allied forces widened, not from anger, not from rivalry, but from a simple animal truth: fear keeps you alive. Whitfield watched the new separation form like a boundary line. No one had drawn on a map. He could feel the unease spreading through the base. The Australians weren't just fighting the Viet Cong. They were fighting the jungle itself and turning everything around them, even their own supplies, into a field of danger. That was the real message of the exploding pack. These ghosts of the forest weren't only lethal to the enemy, they were lethal to anyone who didn't understand their rules. And their rules weren't spoken. They were silence, traps and patience, a kind of discipline so extreme it looked almost inhuman. Whitfield started to see them less as conventional soldiers and more as practitioners of a grim craft, monks of a harsh faith, where the only commandment was survival, no matter the cost. And soon he'd learn that smell and booby traps were just the surface. The real terror was psychological. Numbers that shocked. American analysts loved ratios. Numbers gave the war a shape the human mind could tolerate. By the late 1960s, U.S. casualty exchange rates often hovered around 10-1, 10 enemy dead for every American life lost. It was grim arithmetic, the cold logic of attrition that defined the Pentagon's approach. But in Phuoc Tuy, the Australian SAS were producing figures that looked like typos. Not 10-1, not 50-1. Exceptionally high kill ratios were sometimes reported, though later retellings often exaggerated the exact numbers, so absurdly high that many American intelligence officers dismissed it at first. Propaganda, clerical error, statistical noise. How could a unit that rarely had more than 150 operators in country outperform entire U.S. brigades? The answer wasn't heavier weapons. It wasn't superior air power. The Australians often carried less than their American counterparts. The difference was philosophical. The Americans fought the war they wanted, trying to force the jungle to obey. The Australians fought the war that existed and surrendered their ego to the rules of the forest. But their greatest advantage wasn't something you learned at West Point or in a doctrine manual. It was older than civilization. Patience as weapon. The U.S. war machine ran on movement. Rapid mobility, overwhelming force, industrial scale. Bombers could flatten hillsides. Defoliants could strip entire stretches of jungle bare. It was a strategy of noise and violence, designed to crush resistance through volume. A typical American patrol moved like an armored idea. Radios, engines, boots, metal and weight, backed by artillery and air support. The Viet Cong often heard them coming long before they saw them. The Australians looked at that and called it suicide. Their philosophy could be summed up in a single word American commanders hated: patience. An SAS patrol might insert by helicopter, move a few hundred meters, and then stop. Not for minutes, for hours, sometimes days. They waited until the jungle forgot they were there, until birds returned, insects resumed their rhythm, and the forest stopped reacting. In their world, movement was danger, silence was information. They didn't hunt the enemy the way conventional forces imagined. They became the trap, and let the enemy walk into it. And to perfect this method, they leaned on something the modern military rarely respected enough: true tracking. Eyes of the trackers. Aboriginal trackers attached to Australian SAS elements brought skills refined over tens of thousands of years. An understanding of ground and sign that felt supernatural to Western eyes. A tracker could study a bent blade of grass, a scuffed patch of dirt, a faint scrape on bark, and tell not only that someone passed, but how heavy the load was, how fast they were moving, and sometimes even whether they were calm or afraid. They taught the SAS to read the jungle like a manuscript, written in tiny disruptions. A snapped twig at shoulder height meant carelessness. Mud that dried slightly faster meant a footprint made recently. A bird lifting suddenly wasn't scenery, it was an alarm bell. While American units searched for bunkers, battalions, and clear targets, the Australians searched for displaced pebbles, brushed vines, unnatural silence. This microscopic attention let them shadow Viet Cong units for days without being detected, moving like a second shadow behind the first, waiting until the moment the enemy felt safest. And when they struck, the entire dynamic of the war flipped. For the first time, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops experienced something new. They were no longer the hunter, they were being hunted. They began to feel watched in places they believed belonged to them. Rest stops didn't feel safe anymore. Campsites felt haunted. The jungle, once their greatest ally against loud conventional forces, began to feel like it had turned against them. The Australians didn't try to remake Vietnam into a battlefield that suited them. They adapted to Vietnam and used its own rules to dismantle men who thought they understood it best. In a war of shadows, the loudest gun didn't win. The sharpest eye did. But this supreme patience carried a cost that no exchange ratio could ever record. A cost paid in flesh and in the soul. Operation Leech. To understand what patience truly meant to these men, you had to look away from the dry jungle trails and into the black, stagnant water of the mangrove swamps. It was there, in a mission later remembered in veteran lore as Operation Leech, though no official record confirms it, that the Australians were said to have pushed endurance beyond what most medical officers would want to imagine. The target was a high-ranking Viet Cong tax collector, moving money and intelligence through waterways at night, slipping through the swamp's labyrinth by sampan under darkness. The Australians didn't set up a checkpoint. They didn't call an airstrike. They chose something colder. They chose to disappear into the swamp itself. A 5-man team entered the water, thick with waste, rot, parasites, and vanished beneath the surface. Some veteran stories describe teams remaining concealed in swamp water for extremely long periods, though exact durations remain uncertain. No movement, no speech, no relief, no sleep. To breathe they used hollow reeds and modified snorkels, keeping their heads barely above the muck, close enough to air, far enough to remain invisible. They didn't behave like men, they behaved like floating logs. But the water was alive, and it didn't see them as hunters. It saw them as food. Leeches latched onto every exposed inch of skin, feeding until they swelled fat as thumbs. Each man felt every bite, every pull, every slow suction, but moving to rip them off would have given everything away. So they let the swamp eat them. And something worse began happening underneath the surface. Skin turned pale, softened, and started to detach. Some retellings describe severe immersion injuries, maceration, swelling, and skin breakdown, though the exact medical details are hard to verify. The pain was constant, burning, brutal, impossible to ignore. Yet none of them broke discipline. They entered a kind of trance, pain acknowledged, then locked away, stored for later, because later was the only time pain could be afforded. On the third night, the signal came, not spoken, barely even seen. A sampan drifted into moonlight, engine off, crew paddling silently. They scanned the banks for American patrols, never looking down at the black water surrounding their hull. Then the swamp erupted. 5 shapes rose from the darkness, like something born wrong. Water streaming off peeling shoulders. No gunshots. The Australians had agreed. Gunfire would summon enemy units, so they used cold steel. In seconds, it was over. Knives flashed, bodies folded, the tax collector and guards erased before a scream could fully form. Some were pulled down into the water, others slumped over the gunwales, like discarded sacks. The operation ended as quietly as it began. But the image that haunted debriefing officers came afterward, when the team climbed onto dry land beneath harsh extraction lights. They looked like biological nightmares, skin wrinkled and torn, blood from hundreds of bites that wouldn't clot, the stink of swamp rot and dried iron, their bodies shaking uncontrollably as temperature crashed. Yet their eyes remained calm, not proud, not excited, just controlled. They hadn't merely endured suffering, they had weaponized it, and word traveled through the Viet Cong hierarchy like a sickness. You are not safe in the jungle, and now you are not safe in the water. Some veterans later claimed enemy fighters began to believe Australian patrols could appear almost anywhere, and as terrifying as their physical feats were, Whitfield would soon witness their final layer of warfare, the kind that didn't aim at the body at all, but at the enemy's oldest, darkest superstitions.